You never know how a simple walk can change the course of your evening or even your perspective on life. Last night I stepped into the park under a sky that was more stars than darkness, expecting nothing but the soft crunch of leaves under my shoes and maybe a little peace for myself. What I didn't expect was to meet someone who would remind me that connection, even in the quietest moments, can be as surprising as it is comforting. Don't forget, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I hadn't planned to be out late. It was just one of those evenings where the house felt too loud, too full of thoughts bouncing around like restless birds. I needed air, the kind that carries away tension instead of just stirring it up. So, I pulled on my jacket, slipped my phone into my pocket, and walked up the door. The park was only a few blocks from my apartment, but as I approached, the ordinary streets transformed into something quiet, almost sacré. The streetlights spilled soft pools of gold onto the pavement, and the shadows between them seemed almost alive, stretching lazily, like they had all the time in the world. The first thing I noticed as I entered the park was how empty it was. Not a soul in sight, except for a few distant figures who looked like ghosts moving with their own silent purpose. A gentle breeze stirred the branches overhead, and I could hear leaves rustling like whispered secrets. The scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of winter blooming flowers filled the air. It was beautiful in that quiet, almost melancholic way that made you want to stop breathing for a moment just to absorb it. As I walked further, hugging the path that curved around the small pond in the center of the park, I spotted a figure sitting on one of the benches. He wasn't doing anything unusual, just sitting, hands resting on a cane, looking down at the water. Something about him stopped me in my tracks. He was elderly, probably in his 70s, with silver hair that caught the light in a halo-like way. Qua! His coat was simple but neat, and there was a calmness about him that made the park feel warmer somehow, even in the crisp night air. "Good evening," I said, almost automatically, unsure if he would even respond. "Good evening," he replied, his voice soft, but clear with a tone that made it feel like he had the time to really listen. I took a hesitant step closer, not wanting to intrude, but also curious. "Isn't it beautiful tonight?" I asked, gesturing vaguely toward the pond where the moonlight shimmered on the surface. "It is," he said, his eyes following mine for a moment before settling on the water again, almost like it's keeping its own secrets. I laughed softly, a little surprised by the poetic phrasing. Most people don't talk like that anymore, not casually. "I like that," I said, keeping its secrets. "I suppose we all have a few ourselves." He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt an unexpected warmth from the way his gaze lingered. "That we too," he said, "and sometimes the night is the best place to think about them." We fell into a kind of rhythm, walking slowly along the path, our steps echoing in the quiet. I didn't know his name yet, but I found myself telling him small things about my day, about the minor worries that had been circling my mind for weeks. He listened, truly listened. It was the kind of attention that feels rare and precious, like someone has put down the weight of their own life to really be present for you. When I asked him his name, he smiled. "Brian," he said simply. I introduced myself. "Deborah." It felt strange to give my real name to a stranger in the middle of a park at night, but there was something about him that made it feel safe. Not in the usual cautious sense, but in the way you trust someone who moves slowly and speaks gently. As we walked, I noticed the details I had been missing. The subtle shimmer of frost on the grass, the way the trees swayed even without wind, the distant hum of traffic soft by the night. Brian noticed them, too. He pointed out the tiny patterns of ice on a puddle, the shape of the clouds floating above, the way the moonlight turned the pond into a sheet of molten silver. He didn't just observe, it made me say. And for the first time in weeks, I felt entirely present. There was an unspoken tension, though, a quiet curiosity that made me lean just slightly toward him when we talked. It wasn't romantic in the usual sense, not at all. It was more intimate than that. Two people bridging an unexpected gap, sharing something ephemeral but genuine. He asked questions that weren't intrusive, that invited reflection rather than confession. I found myself answering honestly, not out of habit, but because it felt natural. At one point, We stopped at a bench near the edge of the pond. The water mirrored the moon and stars, making it feel like we were sitting in the middle of a painting. Brian rested his cane beside him, then turned to me. "You know," he said quietly, "most people are afraid of the night, afraid of what they can't see, afraid of what might be waiting." I smiled faintly. "I used to be. I still am sometimes. But tonight, it feels different. Good. Different. I hope," he said, his eyes crinkling with a hint of a smile. "Yes," I admitted, "quite different. For a long while, we just sat there listening to the gentle lapping of the water, to the distant sounds of the city, and to the quiet rhythm of our own breathing. I realized that the world could feel both enormous and intimate at the same time, and that sometimes you needed the presence of another person to really understand that." By the time I finally checked my watch, hours had passed. Or maybe it was only minutes. Time felt suspended. Brian stood, picked up his cane, and offered me a hand. I took it, and it was warm, steady, grounding. "Thank you, Deborah," he said. "For the company? For seeing things with me?" I nodded, feeling the weight of those words, the unexpected tenderness they carried. "Thank you too, Brian, for everything." And as I walked back home, the night felt less lonely, more alive. I didn't know if I would see Brian again, but I knew I would carry the memory of that evening with me. The quiet understanding, the gentle connection, the reminder that some encounters are meant to change how you feel about the world. The next evening, I found myself thinking about Brian long before I even realized it. The memory of our walk lingered, not in a restless way, but like a gentle hum at the edge of my thoughts. There's something strange about meeting someone unexpectedly. Someone who makes even silence feel meaningful. And I hadn't had that in a long time. My curiosity was growing, not just about him, but about the ease I had felt with him. Like I could be myself without the usual masks, the small defenses we carry everywhere. I debated whether to go back to the park. Part of me hesitated, wondering if tonight would feel forced or awkward. But the other part, the part that had smiled in quiet awe at the moonlight on the pond, pusid mitogo. I wanted that feeling. Again, the calm, the subtle understanding, the comfort of someone else noticing the little things. By the time I arrived, the park had taken on a slightly different character. The streetlights flickered in the same steady rhythm, backed to shadow. Seemed deeper tonight, as if the darkness had stretched while I wasn't looking. The air was crisper, carrying a faint hint of frost and the scent of winter roses clinging stubbornly to the bushes. I wrapped my scarf a little tighter around my neck and started down the winding path, expecting maybe to walk alone, maybe to lose myself in thought again. But then I saw him. Brian was sitting on the same bench near the pond, his cane resting against the side, his posture calm, almost meditative. For a moment. Primera, hesitate. It was strange how someone could feel so familiar and yet still seem like a stranger. I walked slowly toward him, not wanting to disturb whatever rhythm he had settled into. "Evening, Deborah," he said, without looking up at first. When he did, his eyes met mine, and I felt the same warmth that had stayed with me since our first encounter. "Evening, Brian," I replied, smiling. "I wasn't sure I'd see you here tonight." He gestured toward the bench beside him. "I come here often. There's something about this time, the quiet, the stillness. It makes the world feel manageable, don't you think?" I sat down carefully, feeling the chill of the wood through my coat. Yes, it's like the world slows down for a moment, just enough to catch a breath. We sat in silence for a little while, watching the pond mirror of the stars and the pale moonlight. I noticed a few ducks paddling Leslie along the edge, leaving tiny ripples that disturbed the silver reflection. The scene was simple, but it had a weight to it, like the kind of peace you don't realize you've been craving until you finally have it. "You look thoughtful tonight," Brian said softly. "Is something on your mind?" I hesitated, the usual urge to deflect surfacing, but it didn't feel right here. "I've been thinking about last night." I admitted about how easy it felt to talk with you to just pee. "I don't usually feel that way with people I don't know." He nodded slowly, almost as if he expected that. "It's rare, isn't it, to feel understood, without having to explain every detail of yourself." I smiled at that, feeling a strange mix of relief and connection. "Exactly. You make it simple. Not in a boring way, but in a way that makes me think I'm seen.
Brian's gaze softened, and for
A moment I noticed the subtle lines around his eyes, the small gestures that spoke of a life lived fully but quietly. Deborah, he said after a pause, sometimes connection doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from showing up, from noticing, from listening, and from allowing yourself to trust even a little. There it was again, the intimacy of his words, the gentle insistence that some moments mattered precisely because they were fleeting. I felt my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't romantic in the usual sense. It was something quieter, something more profound, a recognition that two people, even of different ages, could meet in a shared space of respect, curiosity, and understanding. I think I'm starting to understand that, I said softly, letting the words float out into the night. It's nice to realize it's possible. He smiled. Small, but genuine. It is. And sometimes the night gives us the courage to see it. We began to walk again, side by side, our steps measured and Brian talked about the park, about the subtle changes of seasons, about the history of the trees and the small wildlife that often goes unnoticed. I listened. But more than that, I noticed not just him, but how the night felt different because of his presence, how the air seemed warmer, how shadows could be inviting instead of intimidating. At one point, I glanced at him and noticed something I hadn't before. The quiet way he observed the world, the way he smiled at things most people overlook. It was humbling in a way I didn't expect. I realized I had been rushing through life, missing the small, meaningful moments. And here was a man, a stranger, showing me that noticing was enough, that listening could be transformative. Do you come here alone often? I asked tentatively. Mostly, he admitted, but tonight I hoped I wouldn't be alone in the sense that matters. Even when it's silent, sharing it makes it richer. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into me. Sharing the night, sharing the quiet, had made something inside me shift. The subtle tension between us, curiosity, mutual respect, a hint of wonder, was comforting rather than confusing, and I felt for the first time in a long while that the world could be both safe and profound at once. As we reached the far end of the park, the one with the wrought iron gates silhouetted against the night sky, Brian stopped and turned to me. Tarar, thank you for walking with me again, he said, his voice carrying the same warmth, the same calm authority that made me feel understood. Thank you, Brian, I replied, smiling, for letting me see tonight differently. And as I walked back toward home, the memory of our conversation lingered, like the quiet echo of a song you didn't know you needed to hear. I knew I would return. Again, not just for the park, but for the connection, the reflection, and the gentle discovery of something unexpectedly significant. The next time I returned to the park, I felt a small thrill of anticipation that I hadn't expected. It wasn't the kind of excitement that made your heart race or your stomach flip. It was quieter, warmer. A feeling like something important was waiting for me just around the next bend. The air had a crispness that hinted at the coming winter, and the path was lined with bare trees whose branches looked like the delicate lines of a sketch against the evening sky. I spotted Brian almost immediately sitting on the same bench near the pond. This time, he had a small notebook on his lap, a pen tucked behind his ear. The sight made me smile. He seemed to carry his thoughts with him like a companion, as if the night itself had inspired him to write. Evening, Deborah, he greeted me, his voice soft but steady. Evening, Brian, I replied, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the repetition of our ritual. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Not at all, he said, tapping the notebook lightly. Just jotting down some thoughts. The night has a way of bringing things into focus. I sat beside him, the chill of the bench seeping through my coat, and we watched the water. The pond reflected the moon like a silver mirror, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a fish or a drifting leaf. It was silent in a way that felt alive, full of small movements and sounds if you paid attention. Brian, I said after a moment, do you ever feel that life moves too fast? That sometimes we miss things that really matter? He looked at me thoughtfully, his eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. All the time, he admitted. I spent years moving so quickly that I forgot to notice the small, beautiful parts of life. Moments like this, they are rare, but they teach you something you can't learn in a hurry. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I had spent so much of my life chasing deadlines, obligations, and routines that the quiet beauty of the present often slipped by unnoticed. And yet here I was, walking and talking with a man I barely knew, discovering a richness that felt almost sacred in its simplicity. We fell into conversation, slowly peeling back the layers of our lives in the way strangers sometimes do when the night allows it. Brian spoke of his younger years, of travels he had taken, friends he had loved, and regrets that had lingered like shadows. He didn't overshare, but each memory carried warmth and honesty that made me feel trusted, honored, even just to be listening. I shared parts of my life, too. Not the big, polished versions, but the small, messy detail. The nights I felt alone in my apartment, the moments when I questioned the choices I had made, the tiny joys that kept me going. He listened with an intensity that made me feel seen, really seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. At one point he paused, looking down at his notebook. "You know, Deborah," he said softly, "sometimes we need someone to remind us of our own stories, to show us that what we think is ordinary is actually extraordinary in its own way." Primera smiled, feeling a lump in my throat. "You do that for me," I admitted. "Just by listening, by noticing, He glanced at me, his eyes reflecting a mixture of kindness and quiet understanding. "And you do the same for me, sharing these nights, your thoughts, your presence. It's a gift I didn't expect." For a while we sat in silence, letting the night carry our thoughts. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the city, the occasional splash of water from the pond, all of it seemed amplified by the intimacy of the moment. There was a subtle tension between us, not romantic in a conventional sense, but something that carried a deep emotional resonance, a sense of trust, of vulnerability, of mutual respect that made the ordinary act of sitting together feel profoundly significant. At one point, I noticed the way his hands rested on his notebook, steady and deliberate. I felt an urge to reach out, not in a romantic way, but in a human way, to acknowledge the shared quiet, to affirm that this connection mattered. "Brian," I said softly, "I'm grateful for this, for tonight, for your stories, for everything." He looked at me then, his gaze lingering a little longer than before. "Deborah," he said, "life is strange. We meet people at the strangest times, and sometimes they change the way we see the world without even trying. I think this is one of those times." I felt a warmth spread through me, a mixture of gratitude, a quiet happiness. It was rare to encounter someone who could touch your life so profoundly without demanding anything in return. The night, the park, the pond, the soft glow of the moon, it all felt like a private world, a bubble of understanding and reflection that existed just for the two of us. We continued our walk side by side, letting the conversation drift from memories to small observations. The way frost formed delicate patterns on the grass, the way the air smelled faintly of pine and winter blooms, the subtle sounds of the city that reached a soft and distant. Every detail felt heightened, more vivid, because it was shared. By the time we reached the wrought iron gates again, the night had deepened and the air had grown colder. Brian turned to me, leaning slightly on his cane. "Thank you, Deborah," he said, his voice gentle but steady, "for walking with me, for listening, for being here." "Thank you, too, Brian," I replied, feeling the emotion well and up again, "for reminding me how beautiful the night can be, how meaningful quiet moments can be." We parted then, each walking in our own direction, but the sense of connection lingered like a soft echo. I realized as I made my way home that some encounters leave a mark not because they're dramatic or life-altering in obvious ways, but because they touch the part of you that quietly hungers for understanding, for attention, for someone to notice. The small, overlooked moments that make life worth living. That night, I went to bed feeling lighter, calmer, and more aware. There was something transformative about meeting Brian, about sharing stories and silences, about discovering that even brief encounters can carry a depth that resonates long after the night ends. I didn't know what tomorrow or the next walk would bring, but I knew that something precious had begun.